He bought her home for £1 and called it fair. She never forgot the number. 12 years later, she came back. The house was a shell. Rain came through the roof like judgment. But her father had hidden something in the walls the Lord never found. The stone came away easier than it had any right to, a hand-sized block of soot-black limestone that had been sitting loose in the chimney breast for God knows how long. And Eleanor Hardwick knelt there in the ash with it heavy in both hands and stared into the hole it left. Something was wedged in the dark, leather, cracked at the spine. She didn't reach for it yet. That's the thing about a woman who's spent 12 years being told to wait. She's learned how to hold a moment before it breaks. She set the stone down on the hearth, wiped her palms on the coarse brown apron, and pushed a loose strand of dark chestnut hair back from her face with the back of her wrist, leaving a smear of soot along her cheekbone. The brass key on its loop of black cord swung forward from her collar and tapped against the cold stone. 12 years, that hole had been waiting. Let me take you back, because you need the number. 1847, autumn. The Hardwick family standing on their own gravel drive in the rain while a man in a bottle-green silk waistcoat walked their house room by room like he was checking a horse's teeth. Lord Augustus Vane. Iron-gray hair oiled back off that high forehead, close-trimmed side whiskers, that heavy gold watch chain draped across his belly which he consulted every 90 seconds as though the world were running behind schedule for his convenience. The auction lasted 4 minutes. Nobody bid against him. Nobody was going to. This was a man who owned half the valley's mortgages and every clerk who wrote them. He raised one finger. £1. A single sovereign, laid on the table like a coin dropped in a beggar's cup. And when Eleanor's father, a decent man ruined by a bad harvest and a worse loan, asked him quietly if the family might have a week to remove their belongings, Vane took out that watch, snapped it open, looked at it, snapped it shut and said, "You may have until dark, and do try not to weep on the carpets. They're mine now." He meant it as a joke. He was the only one who laughed. Eleanor was 20 then. She remembers the sovereign more clearly than she remembers her mother's face that day. She remembers Vane's coachman kicking their crate of kitchen things off the step because it was in the way. And she remembers Vane pausing at the door, looking at the girl standing straight-backed in the rain with her chin level and her hands clasped low in front of her, and saying to his solicitor, loud enough to carry, "They'll be in a poorhouse by spring. That sort always sinks. You can't teach a scullery bloodline to hold land." That sort. He never even learned her name. So here's what that sort did. She went into service. Scullery first, then laundry. 12 years of it. Lye that ate the skin off her knuckles every winter, coppers of boiling water hauled by hand, 6 days a week and half of Sunday. She wore the same charcoal wool traveling coat the whole time, and patched the left elbow herself with mismatched gray thread, because matching thread cost a penny more, and a penny was a penny. And every week she put coins in a tin. Not pounds, shillings, sometimes pence. The tin lived under a loose board beneath her cot, and it rattled less than you'd think, because rattling means air, and air means space, and she filled every inch of it. 12 years of other people's dirty linen turned into £5 sterling. £5. Because that's what the second auction wanted. See, Vane had let it rot. Of course he had. He never wanted a house, he wanted a win. And once he'd won it, he stripped the good timber, sold the lead off 2 roofs, and left Ashcombe Hall to the weather for a decade like a carcass he couldn't be bothered to bury. When the county finally put it up again in '59 as a derelict liability, nobody in 3 parishes would touch it. Nobody except a woman in a patched coat with a tin full of shillings. £5. She counted it out on the auctioneer's table in coins, and the room went quiet the way rooms do when they don't know whether to laugh or feel ashamed. She walked up to it alone. The gate had come off its upper hinge and hung there at an angle like a jaw that had been broken and never set. Beyond it, the drive was gone to grass, and the house stood at the end of it with its windows blank. 14 rooms, and she counted them that first afternoon with a stub of pencil and a scrap of paper. 6 habitable, and habitable was generous. 2 roofs intact out of 5 sections. The east wing had buckled inward under the weight of a fallen chimney and simply been left to hold that shape, plaster hanging off the lath in gray tongues, wallpaper peeling back to reveal an older pattern underneath. Roses faded to the color of weak tea. The cellar had 11 inches of standing water in it. She measured with a broom handle and a chalk mark. 11 inches, black and still, smelling of iron and old stone, with the reflection of the trap door floating in it like a second door under water. And on the kitchen step, waiting, sat a cat. Thin gray thing, ribs showing plain through the fur, one ear notched. It didn't run, it didn't rub against her. It just looked up at her with the flat, unhurried patience of an animal that has been waiting a very long time and knew somebody would eventually come. She had bread and a rind of cheese in her pocket. She gave it the cheese. It ate without hurry and stayed. The first night, she found the one dry bedroom, north-facing, second floor, where the roof had held and the plaster was still sound enough to knock and hear solid. She swept it with a bundle of birch twigs because she had no broom. She slept in her coat. But before that, before sleep, she'd done the thing that mattered. She'd laid a fire in the kitchen range. Old cast iron thing, rusted at the hinges, choked with a decade of ash. She cleared the firebox by hand, found dry kindling in the woodshed where somebody long dead had stacked it under an oilcloth, and struck a match. And the range drew. It drew clean and steady, the flame pulling sideways up into the flue like it had been waiting for permission, and the whole cold kitchen began to smell of wood smoke instead of damp. She sat on the floor in front of it with the gray cat, and she didn't cry. She'd used all that up in 1847. 2 mornings later, she was clearing the drawing room chimney breast, the cracked one, the one that had shed half its render, when her scraper caught an edge and the stone shifted. Which brings us back to now, to her knees in the ash and the leather thing in the dark. She reached in and drew it out. A journal. Cover swollen with damp, string-tied, heavier than it looked. She carried it to the kitchen, set the candle beside it, and opened to the first page. The hand was her father's. Dated the 4th of March, 1847. 7 months before Vane's single pound. 7 months before any of them knew. And when she turned the cover flat, something small and hard shifted inside the spine, sewn in under the leather with black thread. She worked the stitches loose with her thumbnail. A brass key, smaller than the one at her throat. By dawn, the candle had drowned in its own wax, and the journal lay open on the kitchen table, pages curling in the damp. Eleanor Hardwick sat where she'd sat all night, the charcoal wool coat still buttoned, the patch at the left elbow gone shiny with wear. The little brass key hung around her neck now, threaded on a loop of black cord. First time she'd worn it. It sat cold against her collarbone and then, slowly, took her heat. She didn't know what it opened. That's the part that kept her up. The cat came in through the gap under the scullery door, thin as a folded glove, and sat on the flagstones watching her like it had been assigned to. Somewhere past 7, the yard gate scraped. A man stood there, broad through the chest, mud-brown canvas work coat, cream shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, a week of stubble on a heavy jaw. Deep blue eyes taking in the sag of the kitchen door like it was a personal insult. In his left hand, a dented tin toolbox with a rope handle. He didn't knock. He didn't introduce himself. He set the box down, lifted the kitchen door clean off its rotted pintles with the ease of a man shifting a chair, and laid it across 2 barrels. Eleanor stood in the doorway, chin level, hands clasped low in front of her, and watched a stranger take her house apart. He planed the swollen edge. He cut 2 oak shims, drove them behind the top hinge, reset the screws into fresh wood instead of the chewed-out pulp they'd been rattling in for 20 years. 2 hours. Maybe less. Then he hung it, swung it, and it closed with a sound Eleanor hadn't heard from any door in that building. A clean, dry click. "Frame sound," he said. "Rot's only surface." Then he picked up the tin box and walked out the gate. That was the whole conversation. Thomas Breyer, though she wouldn't have his name for another 2 days. The cellar was next, and the cellar was worse. 11 inches of black water standing over the flagstones, skinned with something that shimmered when the light hit it. No pump, no help. Just a wooden bucket and a rope and a woman in scuffed black boots with the heels worn to a slant, going down the steps and coming up again, and going down and coming up. 60 buckets to the hour. She counted because counting kept her from thinking. The water went from 11 inches to 9, 9 to 7. Her shoulders, strong-shouldered from years of other people's laundry, other people's dishes, burned and then went numb and then just did the work without asking her. By dark, it was 4 inches. She could see the flagstones. She could see the shape of a room under there, the low brick arches, an iron rack still holding 3 bottles. She slept like something dropped. And in the morning, the water was back to 11. Go ahead. Sit with that. A full day of hauling, gone overnight, and no one to blame and nothing to shout at. She sat on the cellar step with the brass key cold against her throat and did not cry, because crying was a thing you did when someone was watching. Thomas came Thursday. He came down the steps without asking, stood in the water in his hobnailed boots, and looked at the drain channel cut into the floor along the north wall. He crouched. He laid a length of string in it with a stone tied to one end and watched the stone sit exactly where he put it. "Runs uphill," he said. "Someone relayed this floor and set the fall backwards. It's been filling itself since before you were born. Failure, it turns out, isn't failure. It's information." They cut a new channel. 2 days of it. Chisel and lump hammer, breaking out the old flags, bedding new ones on a fall of an inch in 10 feet, out through the wall where a blocked weep hole had been packed solid with root. When Thomas punched the root out, the cellar drained itself in 90 minutes while they stood there and watched it go. Neither of them said anything. His shoulder was against hers in the narrow stair. Neither of them moved it. Nights, she read the journal. Her father's hand, cramped and small, dated 1847 and running forward. It wasn't a diary. It was a ledger of a kind she'd never seen. March. William Tapp, roof timbers, £4, 6 shillings, not to be repaid. June. Widow Ellis, passage for son, £11, not called in. November. Crow, medicine, £2, 2 shillings. Told her it was a gift from the parish. Page after page, sums lent and quietly buried. A man everyone in that valley had apparently called cold and close-fisted, keeping a private account of every debt he refused to collect. Eleanor read her father's handwriting by candlelight and understood she had never met him. That's about when the black gig came up the drive. Vane's agent stepped down in polished shoes, and behind him, because Lord Augustus Vane never let another man deliver good news, came Vane himself. Black frock coat, bottle green silk waistcoat, iron gray hair oiled back from a high forehead. He pulled the heavy gold watch chain out, consulted it, and put it back. He would do that 11 times in 9 minutes. I counted for you. He looked at the house. Then he looked at her, at the patched elbow, the coarse brown apron, the loose strands escaping the low twist at her nape. £60, he said, for the shell, which is generous considering what's standing here is a liability with a roof over part of it. Watch chain out, back. Let's be plain, my dear. You've been a scullery woman your whole life. You are not an estate. You'll be gone by the frost, and I would rather buy it from you now than scrape you off it in January. Then, softer, worse. Take the money. Go somewhere your sort can manage. £60. And here's the ugly part. It was a reasonable offer. She had £4 and some coppers to her name. She said nothing. Chin level, hands clasped low. He left the paper on the kitchen table, next to the journal, and drove away pleased with himself. 2 mornings later, a small, stooped woman came up the lane, leaning her weight forward onto a knotted blackthorn stick with a worn brass ferrule. black lace cap over silver-white hair, black wool shawl. In her freckled hand, a rose cutting wrapped in wet sacking. Mrs. Agnes Crow stood in the yard, breathing hard, and looked at Eleanor's face for a long moment. The freckles across the bridge of the nose, the gray-green eyes, the pale thumbprint birthmark below the left jaw. "Your mother planted the white roses by the south wall the spring she carried you," she said. "She told me you'd come back one day. I've kept the cutting alive 31 years waiting to give it to you." The stick trembled. The old woman did not. Behind them, in the doorway, Thomas Breyer had gone very still. He wasn't looking at the roses. He was looking past Eleanor into the pantry, at the shelving, at the wall behind it. "That plaster," he said, "is newer than the wall." The shelving came down that same afternoon because Eleanor Hardwick was not a woman who waited on second opinions. 4 pine boards, 30 years of flour dust in the joints, and behind them a stretch of wall that was, exactly as he said, wrong. Newer plaster, whiter, smoother where the rest of the pantry was rough lime over horsehair, gone yellow as old teeth. She set her palm flat against it and felt the difference in temperature before she felt it in her fingers. Cold. Colder than a solid wall has any right to be. Thomas Breyer set the dented tin toolbox down by his left boot and opened it without a word. Chisel. Lump hammer. The hobnailed boots caked with dried lime left half prints on the flagstones. She took the chisel first. That mattered. Her house, her wall, her knuckles. The plaster came off in sheets, then in fists, then in a choking white fog that got into the loose strands at her temple and turned the charcoal wool of her coat gray from shoulder to the patched left elbow. Under it, lath. Under the lath, a door frame. Oak, the old kind, cut when trees were allowed to grow old, and set into it a door that somebody had nailed shut and then buried behind 2 inches of lime so nobody would ever ask about it again. Sealing a door is easy. Sealing a question is not. The nails were hand-forged and stubborn, and it took them the better part of an hour. When the door finally gave, it did not swing. It sighed. Air came out of that room that had been sitting still since before she was born, and it was cold, and it was dry. Bone dry, the dry of a place the damp never found. And it smelled of tallow and paper and cold iron. Eleanor stood in the doorway with the brass key on its black cord resting against her collar, and did not go in. "Chimney first," Thomas said. "You'll want light in there, and you'll want warmth. Room like that, you bring wet air in on your clothes, and it'll do more harm in a week than 40 years did." 2 sentences. From him, that was practically a speech. So they did the chimney. The kitchen range still drew, barely, but the flue behind it was a ruin of loose pargeting and soot the thickness of a thumb. He showed her how it was done. Brush from below, scrape the sides, then the lining, a clay and lime slurry worked up in stages so it keyed to the brick instead of sliding straight down onto the fire back. 3 days of it. Her arms shook. Her shoulders, strong-shouldered from years of scullery work and laundry water, burned anyway. Then they lit it, and the whole damn kitchen filled with smoke. Not a wisp, a wall of it, pouring back into the room, out of the range door, up around the mantel, thick and gray and stinking, driving them both out into the yard, coughing like miners. Eleanor stood in the wet grass with her eyes streaming and looked at 3 days of work going backwards. And if you have ever put everything you had into something and watched it fail on the first turn, you know exactly what her face was doing. Thomas didn't say sorry. He looked up at the roofline for about 10 seconds, then went and got a ladder. The flue cap was choked. 40 years of jackdaws, nest on nest on nest, twigs and mud and feathers packed down into a plug you could have stood on. Small noise, that. A bird building a home in a warm chimney. Small noise. Catastrophic failure, because that plug was why the last owner of this house stopped lighting fires in the kitchen. And stopped lighting fires is why the damp took the east wing, and the damp taking the east wing is why the place sold for £1 to a woman everyone assumed would be gone by Michaelmas. Every ruin starts as something a bird did. He brought it down in armfuls. They lit it again at dusk. The flame stood up straight, and the draw pulled clean and steady, and the range began to breathe for the first time in 4 decades. And Eleanor Hardwick put both hands flat on the warm iron and stood there with her chin level and said nothing at all. The work after that had a rhythm to it. Plaster hacked back to the lath in the passage. Rubble carried out and stacked square by the wall, because he stacked everything square. They argued exactly once, about the wall between the passage and the old still room, her saying, "Take it out," him saying, "That's carrying the floor above." "It's not load-bearing," she said. "It's lath and plaster. It's got a bressummer in it." They both reached for the same beam to prove it, and their hands landed together on the same cold oak. Hers slim and raw-knuckled, his broad and calloused with that faint freckling across the back, and the little pale birthmark at the base of his thumb. Neither of them moved for a second longer than the argument required. He was right. The wall stayed. It was the 4th day when she went back to the sealed room with a lamp. 6 feet by 9. No window. A deal table, a chair, and a shelf of tallow candle stubs standing in their own frozen puddles. And on the floor beneath the table, a japanned strongbox, black lacquer chipped to bare tin at the corners, with a lock so small and so particular that she had already seen its match, because the little brass key sewn into the spine of that journal had been sitting against her breastbone on a loop of black cord since the morning she found it. It turned on the second try. Inside, a bundle of receipts tied in tape, a leather purse, heavy, and a ledger, foolscap, bound in green cloth, the corners soft as cloth gets when hands have been on it for years. She opened it on the deal table with the lamp at her elbow, and this is the part I wanted to tell you about, so stay with me. It wasn't one secret. It was 40 years of them, column after column, in a small, tight hand. Dates from 1839 forward. Names, half of them still living in the village, she'd walked past their gates. Sums, £2, £9, 40 for a roof, 12 for a doctor's account, 15 to a man whose grandson now shod horses on the Ludlow Road. And beside each entry, in the same tight hand, the same 3 words over and over, hundreds of times, going down the pages like a heartbeat. Not to be repaid. Her father, the quiet man they'd all called proud and cold and closed-handed, the man the whole village owed and none of them knew it, because he'd written it down and told no one, and then he'd sealed the room and let them think whatever they liked. She turned the pages faster, and then, near the front, under the year 1847, she found her own name, Hardwick, E., written in ink that had gone brown with age, in a hand that was not her father's. Hardwick, E. Not her father, not a cousin. Her. Written in a hand she didn't know, in ink gone brown as dried tea, on a line dated 11 years before she ever set foot on this ground. She sat on an upturned crate in the sealed room, with the lamp hissing beside her and the japanned strongbox still cold against her ankle, and she read that line 8 times, and it said the same thing every time. If you've come this far with her, stay, because what she finds behind a strip of rotten baseboard in about 3 weeks' time is the whole reason I wanted to tell you this story, and everything between here and there is just her deciding not to quit first. Word travels in a village faster than damp travels up a wall. Somebody saw the light in the north wing. Somebody mentioned it in the tap room. And on a Tuesday morning with frost still white in the ruts of the drive, a carriage came up through the gate that Eleanor had rehung herself, and Lord Augustus Vane stepped down onto his own good polished black shoes, in his black frock coat over that bottle green silk waistcoat, and looked at the house the way a butcher looks at a carcass. He didn't come inside. He stood in the yard with one hand tucked behind his back and the heavy gold watch chain draped across his belly, and he pulled the watch out and consulted it before he said a single word, as though her existence were an appointment he was fitting in. £300, he said, which is 295 more than the place cost you, and rather more than it's worth with a woman in it. She stood on her own steps in the charcoal wool coat with the elbow patched in mismatched gray thread, chin level, hands clasped low, a smear of lime dust along her jaw, and the little brass key on its black cord under her collar. He kept talking. That's the thing about men like Vane. They never need an invitation. They only need an audience. You're a scullery woman, Mrs. Hardwick. I say that without malice. You have washed other people's linen and emptied other people's slops, and there is no shame in it. But it has not equipped you to hold 14 rooms and 11 acres against a winter. The watch came out again. By March, you'll be selling the lead off the roof to buy coal. By April, you'll be back in service somewhere in Yorkshire, telling the other girls you once owned an estate, and they will laugh at you, and they will be right to. I'm offering you the dignity of leaving before that happens. Take it. Be grateful. People of your sort usually are. He snapped the watch shut on the word grateful. She said nothing, which cost her more than shouting would have. The paper he left on the kitchen table was cream-laid and heavy and smelled faintly of his cologne, and it sat there for 19 days, like a tooth she couldn't stop touching with her tongue. Because here's the ugly arithmetic. £300, and the roof over the West Range needed 41 new slates and the batten to hang them on, which was £11 she didn't have. The chimney breast in the morning room wanted relining. Lime came at 2 shillings the bushel, and she'd already gone through 9. She had £4 and 6 in a tin, a sack of oats, half a ham, and a cat who'd taken up permanent residence on the range hob and had gone from a skeleton to merely thin. The strongbox from the sealed room had a lock she had no key for. The solicitor in Bridgeford had not answered 2 letters, and the wind came off the fields at night and got under the West Range slates and lifted them and let them down again, over and over, like something breathing. Come the 20th night, she was alone in the one dry bedroom with a candle burning down in a saucer, the offer flat on the table, the pen filled, her hair coming loose from its low twist at the nape the way it always did by evening. "Nobody's coming," said the room. "Nobody came for 40 years. She put the nib to the paper. She got as far as the E and the long stroke of the H, and her elbow knocked the candle, and the candle rolled, and she went down on her knees after it, and that's when she saw that the baseboard beneath the window had swelled away from the plaster by half an inch. Damp had done what damp does. She hooked her fingers in and pulled, and the whole 3-foot length came away in a shower of dry mouse bedding and old lime, and behind it, in the cavity between the lath and the outer wall, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with tape gone the color of weak tea, was a bundle of paper. 7 sheets, dated the 4th of November, 1847, signed by 2 witnesses and sealed. A second will. Read it slowly because Vane never got to. The estate at Marrowfield was never sold outright. It was placed in trust, the fabric of the house, the land, and the capital sum of £4,200, invested at 3%, the income to be applied to the relief of tenants and labourers of this parish in such manner as shall not be published or acknowledged. 40 years at 3%. That's £126 a year going quietly out the back door of a house everyone thought was empty. £5,040 of income across 4 decades, plus the principal, still sitting somewhere with her father's name on the deed of trust. And the last clause, in the same brown ink as the ledger, the conveyance of 1847 to be treated as void, being a forced conveyance obtained under duress. Void. The sale that made the Vanes lords of this valley. Void. She was still on her knees at 2 in the morning when the boots came up the passage, because Thomas Breyer had seen a light where a light shouldn't be, and had come across the field with the dented tin toolbox in his left hand out of pure habit. He stood in the doorway in the mud-brown canvas coat, sleeves rolled, freckled backs of both hands lit orange by her candle, and he looked at the papers, and then he looked at the wall she'd torn open, and he set the toolbox down and said the longest thing he'd said in 9 weeks. My father was a plowman here. Broke his leg in the winter of '61. Somebody paid the doctor and paid the rent for 11 months and never once knocked to be thanked. He told me before he died it was Hardwick. That's how I know where the good beams are. I've been in this house since I was a boy, mending what I could because he asked me to. 1 sentence, and 40 years of anonymous ledger entries got a face. She stood up. She took Vane's cream-laid offer with the half-written E on it, and she held the corner into the candle flame until the whole thing curled black in the saucer. I'm not selling. Gray light through the sash window, the kind that doesn't warm anything, dust hanging over a mahogany table, and laid flat on it, weighted at the corners by a brass inkstand and the solicitor's own reading glasses, the second will of Margaret Hardwick, signed, witnessed, dated the 11th of March, 1871, and sealed inside a wall for 22 years because the woman who wrote it knew exactly what her neighbors were. Eleanor sat with her back straight, chin level, hands clasped low in front of her. The charcoal wool coat, patched at the left elbow with mismatched gray thread. The small, tarnished brass key on its loop of black cord resting against her collar. She had not slept. She did not look like a woman who needed to. Across from her, Lord Augustus Vane checked his gold watch chain. Of course he did. He'd checked it in the corridor, he'd checked it on the stairs, he checked it now as though time itself might be persuaded to hand him the estate if he stared at it hard enough. "Read it quickly," he said. "I've a train at noon, and I'd rather not spend the morning humoring a scullery maid's fantasy." That was his last remark as a man who believed he was winning. The solicitor read. Every clause. Blackmore Hall, its outbuildings, its 11 acres of orchard, and the whole of the water meadow beyond, to Eleanor Jane Hardwick, granddaughter, unconditionally, and, in the event of any claim against the property by any party, the executor was directed to open the accompanying accounts. Then came the ledger. Bound in green cloth, spine cracked, 340 pages in a small, tidy hand. Loans made from 1849 onward. Never advertised, never called in. A roof at Selby Cottages, £11. A daughter's schooling, £9 a year for 6 years. A glazier's stock replaced after a fire, £22. Page after page of quiet money leaving a house everybody in the county had decided was empty. And on page 206, in the same hand, a name. Vane. Not Augustus, his father. 4 separate advances against the Vane estate's rents between 1856 and 1863, secured against the Vane land itself, totaling £4,200. Never repaid, never disputed. Interest accruing at 3% compounded for 30 years, because Margaret Hardwick was generous, not stupid, and she wrote everything down. The solicitor read the running total aloud. £9,841 and some odd shillings. Vane's hands went to his forehead, both of them. The watch chain hung forgotten across the bottle green silk, unconsulted for the first time in the entire miserable history of this business. Nobody spoke. The clock in the corner did all the talking. That silence. That was the whole fight, over. Not shouting, not a courtroom, just a room full of gray light and a man discovering that the woman he'd called a squatter with delusions, the woman he'd told to her face that she'd always be servant stock playing at gentry, had been holding his family's debt in her grandmother's handwriting the entire time. He offered to settle. Quietly, he said. Discreetly. Eleanor let him finish. "You'll pay it," she said, "in full, to the trust." And she used it, every penny of it, on other people's roofs. The community came back the way water comes back into a dry channel, slowly, then all at once. First, firewood. A cord of it, split and stacked against the east wall of the kitchen garden, no note, no name, just the axe marks of somebody who knew how to do it properly. Then a roofer named Ackroyd who arrived at 7 in the morning with his own ladders and refused payment, and said only one thing before he climbed. "Your grandmother lent us for our roof in '61. She said not to mention it." He mentioned it once. Then he worked 11 days. A glazier came from Thirsk with a cart of glass and reglazed 9 windows in the long gallery, and told Eleanor his father's shop had burned in 1858, and a woman none of them ever met had replaced the stock. Mrs. Agnes Crow came up the drive on her blackthorn stick, stooped, leaning her weight forward, black lace cap, jet buttons at her throat, carrying a rose cutting wrapped in wet sacking that had been taken from a bush Margaret gave her 30 years before. She put it in Eleanor's hands and said, "She planted the parent of this the year you were born. She said you'd come eventually." Eleanor planted it by the south wall. It took. It always takes, in the stories where somebody stays. The work went the way real work goes. The chimney in the morning room smoked out the whole floor the first time it was lit, because 40 years of jackdaw nesting had turned the flue cap into a plug. Thomas Breyer went up, cleared it, relined the stack with clay pots, and it drew clean the second time. The cellar flooded again 3 weeks after they'd bailed it, 11 inches, because the drain channel ran uphill for 4 feet before it turned. They cut a new run and set it on a fall, and it stayed dry. The lime plaster on the west landing cracked across its whole face because the mix went on too wet in cold weather. Stripped back to the lath, remixed coarser, hair added, 3 thin coats instead of 2, and it held. Every failure taught them the house. That's what nobody tells you about ruins. They're not silent. They're just talking in a language you have to earn. By the second autumn, there were 14 rooms, and 11 of them habitable. The range in the kitchen drew like a furnace. The staircase still groaned on the 6th tread, and nobody fixed it, because it held. And the patches, the newer plaster paler than the old, the replacement floorboards a different grain, the mismatched slate on the north pitch. Nobody painted over any of it. Scars are just proof you didn't leave. Thomas set his dented tin toolbox down at the bottom of the stairs one evening in October, sleeves rolled to the elbow, forearms ruddy, lime dust in the freckles across the backs of his hands. Eleanor came down with her hair coming loose from the low twist at her nape, the way it always did by evening. He reached out and tucked the strand behind her ear. First deliberate touch in 2 years. Brief. That was all. They married in the village church that spring with 16 people present, and the roses were out. 2 winters later, the kitchen is warm at 6 in the morning. The range banked, a thin, patient cat asleep on the flagstones where the heat pools. The roses by the south wall have gone up past the window. There's a woman at the gate with a valise and a coat too thin for the season, standing the way people stand when they've run out of doors. Eleanor opens hers, doesn't ask a single question. The house was never the inheritance. Anybody could have bought it for £5. Nobody wanted it. The inheritance was staying when every sensible voice in 3 counties said go. There's a ledger in the morning room with fresh pages in it, and somebody's writing in it still.